So that gets me to my last argument. Individuals and ideas. And in particular, the change from Putin, the change from Medvedev to Putin as the leader of Russia, starting in the fall of 2011 when he announced he was coming back, and then ever since. And I got to tell you up front, we underestimated, or let me speak for myself. I was the president's chief foreign policy advisor for Russia at the time, so in fact, he got it better than I did. Well, I can tell you about that if you're interested. But we underestimated, in fact, the differences between Putin and Medvedev, now that I see it in retrospect, because we always assumed that Putin was running the show and Medvedev was just his puppet. And so the change from Medvedev to Putin shouldn't change policy that much. That was our assessment. But two things were very different. One, Putin has a different worldview than Medvedev. Putin does see things in more zero-sum terms than President Medvedev. And in particular, Putin has a theory about American power where he believes that we use our covert and sometimes overt force to overthrow regimes that we don't like. And by the way, there's a lot of historical data to support that hypothesis over American history, right? Let's be honest. And when he came to power, that's in the back of his head. It's been in the back of his head ever since he was a KGB officer. And suddenly, the president, to back up a bit, when the president first met with Prime Minister Putin back in July 2009 in Moscow, I was there at the meeting, he tried to disabuse Putin of that theory. He tried to say, I'm different, we're different, this is a different moment in US history, and Putin kind of listened and said, okay, we'll see. And then the Arab Spring happened, and then from Putin's point of view, that was all manufactured by the United States. And then, more importantly, demonstrations in Russia happened in December and January 2011, 2012. And Putin, because of this worldview, two things he did in order to shore up his political base inside Russia. Number one, he started to think of these opposition leaders, these democratic forces, as his enemy, and he began to crack down on them, and by the way, rather successfully. And number two, he portrayed them as puppets of the West, of the United States, of the White House, and eventually of me personally as the US ambassador. That I was the one concocting, orchestrating the revolution against Vladimir Putin inside Russia. And that frame, even if you don't believe it or not, that was the frame that he then changed the way that he dealt with our country. We became, again, for him, the enemy of Russia in his propaganda internally, and I think also in his own way of thinking. But that was not the end of the story, because Putin's a great compartmentalist, right? He could, on the one hand, talk about, and I saw it many times, with American interlocutors and say, I understand you're trying to overthrow the regime in Syria, Egypt, and in my country, and we're enemies on that issue. But over here, if we're going to talk about the ExxonMobil Rosneft deal, we can be partners. And those two sets of preferences are both part of the way that Putin thinks about the world. And when I hear people make it too simple, it's both of those preferences are part of his worldview. And managing those two worldviews has been, his central challenge as the leader of Russia over the last 15 years.